Welcome to Creative Culture. My name is Steve Ramsey, and this is a show about how art and creativity fuel our culture. As always, if you enjoy this podcast, please consider supporting the show over at patreon.com/creativeculturepod, and I'll send you one of these stickers. Last week on the podcast, I forgot to bring one of these stickers to show, so I was just showing nothing. But if you're watching this on YouTube, which is another reminder, the show is also on YouTube now in all of its video glory, so you can check it out there. There's a link down in the thing. But anyways, yeah, I'll send you one of those stickers if you become a patron. And also, please leave a review and a 5-star rating wherever you're listening to this. The most wonderful time of the year is fast approaching. Halloween, of course, and there is no better way to get into the spirit or spirits of the holiday than by getting together with friends to watch some scary movies. But why? Why is it that so many of us love to be scared? Why do we laugh immediately after something on screen makes us jump? Why do some people seek out horror movies all year long? I'm talking about myself here. Always looking for the next big thrill, while other people avoid scary movies at all costs. Is the need for terror something that's just hardwired into our DNA? Nina Nesseth is a science communicator with a background in human biology and the author of Nightmare Fuel, the Science of Horror Films, which is a deep dive into the biological and neurological reasons behind why so many of us love to be scared and how horror filmmakers are experts at exploiting our monkey brains to give us cinematic thrill rides. The book explores the basics of fear and how it works on our brains and bodies. Nina discusses the different types of fear, such as the fear of the unknown, the fear of death, the fear of the body, and explains how horror films use these fears to create visceral experiences for viewers. She examines how sound, music, lighting, and cinematography all work to create a sense of dread. So Nina watched hundreds of horror movies researching this book. Basically that's my dream job right there, from all eras of cinema. And by the way, her entire list of those films is at the end of the book. That kind of makes for a really good playlist. I think I've seen about 75% of these, so this is a great resource for me to catch up. So whether you're an avid horror fan, a science enthusiast, or just fear curious, Nightmare Fuel is well organized, clearly written by a horror fan, and a fantastic read. Nina, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So have you been into horror your entire life?
You know what? The answer is actually no.
Really?
I was a big chicken when I was a kid. I didn't watch any horror growing up, but I did watch a lot of, weirdly, the crime thrillers and erotic thrillers that were big in the 90s. That's when I was
Fatal
a kid.
Attraction.
Maybe not Fatal Attraction right off the top, but we were certainly in that realm when I was a kid, and that was sort of my stepping stone into horror. It's there are a lot more connections between those thrillers and the horror genre than you think once you kind of start dissecting down into the human monster and that sort of piece. But crime thrillers and live action medical, not live action, but the real life scenario medical shows
Sure.
Trauma, Life in the ER, where it's not even just dramatizations. They're actually cameras going through surgeries and showing the real guts and gore. For some reason, my parents were letting me watch that when I was a kid, but not horror movies.
Well, because that's real. I don't know. Somehow there's a distinction between real and fake. So those were your gateway.
Those were my gateways into horror. I didn't come into watching horror on my own until I was living on my own. So as a college student or an adult.
Really?
Yeah.
What were some of those first films that kind of got you hooked?
Well, when I was a kid, I did watch Silence of the Lambs. That's part of the crime thriller kind of piece of things. So that one was one that sort of carried me through. I can name all the ones when I was a kid. I watched Seven when I was a kid.
Oh, that's pretty hardcore there. That was as far as, yeah.
Again, crime thrillers. But once I started watching stuff on my own, I started pretty easy. I didn't see the Scream series until I was in university, which was in like the early 2000s. And like a lot of the teen horrors, like The Faculty, which is one of my favorites to this day, started off with the more playful side of horror.
And then you just got deeper and deeper. And when did the idea for this book come about?
It came about actually through two sort of things. One was the boring answer, which was a call with my agent where we said, well, what do you like? What can we write about? And when I was like, well, I like horror, she was like, you like horror? Why has this never come up before? We can totally like mine this for some interesting science. That's the boring answer. The other answer is that around this time of year, like we're in late September now, and around this time in October, we start seeing articles that come up on the internet that are like, why are we watching horror movies when being scared feels bad? Why do we love horror? And the answer is always the same in these articles. It's always just like about triggering your fight or flight response. And that's part of it. There's no denying that that's part of it, but it doesn't give a fulsome answer of why we love to be scared. And it doesn't really talk about all the other factors that come into what make horror films what they are. And so I've always felt like a sort of pettiness about how shallow these articles can dive into actually figuring out why we're scared. So I wanted to spend, 200 plus pages showing that there's so much more to that answer.
How long did it take you to write the book and research it?
It was a few years. years. So I started writing it in just drafting and outlining back in 2017. So it was a few years of outlining, watching movies, and then getting deep into the research and talking to folks in the horror film industry. So it took a few years to get it all into paper.
Wow, you got to talk to some great people too. Was your family, your wife, everybody on board with all of this whole process, or was there ever a time when you're sitting around like dinner table and they're like, can we please have one dinner without discussing Freddy Krueger or something?
My wife was very supportive, though I could only lean on them so much to watch all of the horror movies with me. I had a sort of pool of friends that I am eternally grateful for, so I didn't have to watch all of these movies on my own. So the book, as you mentioned, I have a whole list of the movies that were cited in the book, which is, I believe, 273 movies. But I watched a lot more than that didn't end up getting cited. I was watching, movies every single day, some better than others, but that's true for any genre.
Do you find that just most of those you've probably forgotten for the most part?
Most of the movies that I've watched?
Yeah, because I find after seeing a lot of movies, once in a while, somebody will bring it up and I'm like, did I see that? Oh yeah, I guess I don't really remember a lot about it though.
I'm blessed with a brain that often forgets the media that I've consumed. So that means I have like high rewatch factor on everything. It's the same thing for books I read. Like I finished reading the book and it was like I read it in a fugue state and enjoyed the experience, but I couldn't tell you what happened. Which, as you can imagine, makes writing on a body of research challenging as well. Yeah. So I feel like I remember, that said, I feel like I remember most of the films that I watched. I'd be hard pressed to like be shown a film and be surprised that I'd already seen it.
That was a lot. That's a long list of films.
It was a long list. Yeah.
Really, really good list. So without getting into the debate of what is a horror film, which horror people love to discuss all the time, what are some common elements that you see in all of these movies or in horror movies?
The common thing I would say is that there has to be some sort of threat, because that's what the entire fear response and the entire like seeking to be scared relies on. And oftentimes like horror critics will frame that threat as a monster. It has to be a monster for it to be horror. Then when you get pedantic about it, it's like, how do we define a monster? Can a human be a monster? Or does that Or is it once that monster is a human and a normal human without any supernatural elements, does that then become a thriller? So that's when you start getting like the Venns of genres. But most people will generally agree that for it to be a horror movie, there has to be some sort of monster. I'm not picky. I think that human monsters definitely count, and that there's a lot of acceptable overlap between thrillers and horror.
Yeah.
And generally something that's like a little bit supernatural, whether it's implied or, and I say implied, like something like Midsommar, which we generally agree is horror. The monsters are human. There isn't really anything supernatural, but there is a sort of mysticism that's woven throughout the Harga and how they interact with the world. So it's not necessarily supernatural, but there's like some sort of adjacency to it, you know?
Yeah. Plus it's sort of drawing on historical previous films such as Wicker Man that are horror. We all kind of agree on that. And so again, it gets lumped in there. But I like that, like the first part of your book kind of really goes deep into our brains and like our physical responses to horror. And I want to get a little bit more into that. So like what parts of our brain are really being active and what parts of our brain react to horror in the way it does and those physiological responses?
Well, I know I said that I get annoyed that the fight or flight response is the only thing that people ever talk about. But really, the fight or flight response is like so key to your fear systems and how you're engaging with threats, and that's basically what's happening when we're looking at monsters on screen and that sort of piece. The idea is that we're perceiving something that can be recognized as a threat. So that's when that fight or flight response comes in. The part of the brain that's key to that fear system is the amygdala, which is this tiny little almond shape. It's a paired structure. So there's kind of two little almond shapes and they're buried deep in your brain. And they are structures that respond to any sort of excitation or arousal. So it's like fear is a form of arousal, sexual arousal counts, aggression, like those sorts of things all feed through the amygdala, which then sends out signals to release hormones and other neurochemical signals throughout the body that then get the action going. So in the amygdala's case, one of the key structures that it'll send signals to are the adrenal glands. They sit right on top of your kidneys. And those are, of course, it's in the name, make adrenaline, but also cortisol, the stress hormone. So you can already get a sense of like, it's creating hormones that help you respond to stressful situations. It's prepping your muscles in case you need to run away or you need to like fight whatever threat's going on. And it narrows your vision, gets your senses kind of like keyed into getting only the crucial information from a scene so that you're not like overwhelmed by all the information that you need to process to survive. And if you ever notice that like when you're stressed out, that your arms and legs get a little bit tingly, that's usually a sign that like your blood and that sort of piece has been rerouted to your internal organs, like those key organs, like your heart and your lungs and everything that you need. That's like crucial. Is just rerouting some of your body's resources to those core structures instead of to your arms and legs. It's really survival mode when you're feeling that.
And so this starts with the amygdala. So the amygdala is before you're really processing anything in the rest of your brain.
So the amygdala, yeah, there's a few steps. There's a few other structures, like I could talk about the thalamus and a few other structures that kind of play into that circuit, but they're mostly in charge of taking in sensory information from your eyes and your ears and your senses and rerouting them to the different parts of your brain. There's a little bit of, yeah, I think it would be fair to say that a lot of this is happening before you're really cognitively processing what's going on, before your brain is really thinking, hey, wait a minute, I'm just looking at something that's on a screen. And once I might be getting ahead of myself a little bit, but once you start to process what's going on and like know that you're watching a movie and get a handle of your fear response, your body's still ready to go. Like you're still up here in this high excitation state, and you are able then to go from the bad feeling of being scared, because it's a crappy feeling. It's not meant to make you feel good, but you can consciously shift it over to pleasure. And that's like the predominant theory for why we like horror movies, is that we're actually able to, once we're processing what's going on, and think, oh yeah, I'm in a theater or I'm at home and I'm not going to die at the hands of, like you said, Freddy Krueger. The thing is not going to like gush out of my screen and assimilate me. Then we can then experience, the fun part of watching a horror movie.
It can be such a fast and dramatic shift. I mean, that swings wild from being terrified to literally laughing out loud at the exact same scene. And it can happen just seconds after it's happened. At first, that response comes in, maybe it's the cliched cat jumping out of the closet or something, or something like that we experience that. And then immediately the reaction is to laugh. It's almost like our brains are telling us, we got to go way overboard the other direction now to make up for that.
Brains are quick. And I find the laugh response, it can be from joy. It can be from relief. I don't know if you've ever had that sort of, that I laugh out of relief all the time. I know I once jumped off a cliff into a lake and hated the experience of free fall so badly that once I landed and was safe, I was laughing maniacally.
It's crazy.
Or laughing because you think it's funny that you jumped, because jump scares and that whole pulling your body in reflex, like you have no control over that whatsoever. Like that's a spinal reflex. It's not even getting to your amygdala at that point. That's just a body reflex that's serving to protect you before you can process anything. Yeah. That's the first line of defense against something that's getting in your face, or that's a loud, sudden noise that could be a threat, maybe.
And so is a large part of that just like unconsciously identifying threats, or is this just, is the ability to identify a threat just something that's been hardwired into us from a million years of evolution?
There is evidence to show that we do have some threat detection systems kind of built in that seem to have been evolved. And the great example would be what's known as snake detection theory, where even young babies, if you show them a picture that has a snake somewhere in it, they'll be able to spot that snake in that picture. So the idea is that we're able to identify that threat, a very old threat, that we can say is an evolved one over generations, or an ancient threat that maybe wouldn't be so big a deal these days, but we're still programmed to identify snakes even in very busy images. We can even identify snakes more easily in images than a hidden gun, for example. So that's a more contemporary fear that we may not have evolved that same level of like spotting ability. It's still there. We can still spot it and identify it as a threat, but it's not as keen yet as something like a spider or a snake, which are kind of older, more hard-grained threats.
And there must be an element of just complete something that's just so incongruous. Is it, what am I thinking? Insidious or Conjuring, where there's the red demon character that appears behind Patrick Wilson's head in one scene, and it's just such, I think it's The Conjuring, isn't it? Is that what I'm thinking?
No, that's Insidious.
Insidious, okay.
Yeah.
And it's just such an unexpected thing that even though I've seen it several times, I jump every time.
It's good. It's really effective, and it's funny that one is so effective for you, even having seen it very many times, because it's one of those things where it's like the rewatchability of things that produce jump scares tends to be pretty low, because the first time that whole jump reflex is really from the suddenness and the unexpectedness of it. So as soon as you're anticipating, your brain and body starts getting into that anticipation with it. And so maybe there is something to be said for you in that you are anticipating that jump a little bit and you're priming your body to jump for it as like a kind of like a little bit of like a reward system piece going on.
Yeah, so I think a lot of times I kind of like to play along with horror movies because I've seen so many of them. So I try to actively put myself in the position of like, I've never seen this before. I'm looking at it with virgin eyes on this movie, or whether it's like Exorcist 3 has a famous one of the ghost running across the hallway. And yeah, I just like to imagine that, I guess.
The Exorcist 3 is the one that gets me every time. And I think part of it is that scene is so long and atmospheric and gives you a few red herring jumps as well. Like it has you jump at the sound of ice cracking and at the sound of a patient yelling. And so you feel like you've gotten your jump scares out. And then it's just such an effective logic bending scare when you have this ghost coming across the screen out of a door that should have been closed. It's just defies logic. Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. And one of the interesting things that I was reading in your book is that we're so used to hearing flight or fight response, but you actually identified that there's 5 different ones of these. You've got fight, flight, and then you freeze. A lot of people, I think, forget about just freezing. I think a lot of animals do that when something is scared, the deer in the headlights kind of a thing. And then you've listed fright and then friend. Can you explain those a little bit more?
Sure. So in terms of the freeze response is a little bit different from other ones because it's literally like the deer in the headlights sort of situation. And when we see it in most animals, the goal of the freeze response is to get more information without inciting attack. And I think it's important to take a step back for a second and say that like all of these, the Fs we'll call them, like we all experience them or a different part, like the different elements depending on what situation you're in. And obviously for some animals, especially if you're like a prey animal, if you were a bunny rabbit, you might favor a certain one of these fear responses more than another based on, what kind of sensory information you get and how easy it is for you to escape a situation. But the same is true for humans is that I tend to run into people all the time who say like, oh, I'm totally a fight or I'm totally a flight. And it's really like, it really depends on what you're experiencing. If you're in a situation where you can escape, most people will try to rather than try and attack the threatening body, we'll say. Attacking the monster if they were real. And for most creatures, fight is only reserved for when you can't escape and your only option is to really confront. Freeze, like I said, is one where it tends to be an information gathering response where you are just trying to, listen, look, and hopefully not be perceived.
And even as a viewer of a horror film, going back to like the Exorcist 3 jump scare, that parts leading up to that is still that freeze moment for a viewer, just to wait and not want to miss a moment.
Yeah. Those moments where you're like really trying forward. Not to breathe and really pay attention to everything that's going on around you. That is... I wouldn't say it's necessarily the freeze response per se, but it's a cousin to it for sure. And then fawn or friend is
it like Stockholm syndrome?
It can be. That's a pretty like extreme example of it, but certainly a softer version of it would be trying to like reason or engage with like this is usually reserved for human threats where you can sort of reason or appeal to the threat and try and like bring them from up here down to a more neutral state so that you can exit that situation. So if a good example is like, someone's screaming at you and you're trying to engage with them in a way that brings them from that screaming anger rage where you think that they might hit you or be threatening to you in some way, kind of talk them down from that. And an extreme version would be Stockholm syndrome for sure, where you're literally befriending your threat. But in that case too, there's a little bit more of a psychological phenomenon at play where you are taking on some of that threats philosophies in a sense.
Right. Everybody's seen that in a couple of the Saw movies with some of the victims.
Yeah, that's actually a great example. Why didn't I use that example in my book?
Call me up for your next book.
I know I used 10 Cloverfield Lane. Michelle in 10 Cloverfield Lane does that as well.
That's such a good movie.
It's that one is a great study in terror and tension.
Yeah.
Not to digress. And then
it's also a good example of a movie that's better than the original. I think.
I mean, it depends on what you're looking for. It's a very different movie, right?
It's a totally different movie, yeah.
And then Fright, I think, had not to skip over.
Right.
That's when we get into what's known as like tonic immobility. So it's a bit different from freezing. It's instead of being deer in the headlights, you literally can't move. And that's usually when you get into like pretty severe crisis situations where the attack is going to happen. The best you can do is sort of just like survive. I don't want to get into like
dead.
It's playing dead, but like you don't really have much choice in the matter. Most people who experience fright, it's like their brain shuts down and their body shuts down on them. And a lot of people don't remember the whole situation because their whole brain and body has gone into survival mode.
I think you cited Martyrs as an example of that.
Martyrs is a great example of that. Good on me for citing that as an example. I love Martyrs. It's one of my favorites.
It is. That is a good movie. That's intense.
But yeah, that's a great example of where these people are undergoing literal torture and essentially like leaving their bodies to survive.
Incident in a Ghost Land. I'm thinking of. I'm sure you've seen that. Also, kind of. In fact, that was the whole conceit of the movie. She was kind of like just leaving her body while all of this trauma was happening.
Mm-hmm. Great example.
So a lot of what we see on the screen is reflected in our bodies at the time. And I know this is different for everybody. And this is why some people just don't like horror movies, is they don't like that feeling. Is it because they can't experience the relief, the joy part after the scares? Or is it just they do not want that feeling of dread at all, any time in their life, even though they know it's not real?
That's a great question. It's a hard one to answer because it is really personal. And I do suspect for some people, it is exactly that. Like they can't make that shift from the bad feeling of being afraid or being disgusted or feeling dread into the fun feeling that people can make that transition to otherwise. And I think that's totally valid. I think some people my sister doesn't watch horror movies at all. She avoids them completely. And when I asked her why, she says, I don't like feeling bad. And that was like the end of it. She's like, I don't like the bad feeling that's associated with this. So that's exactly what you said. It's like the dread, the disgust. A lot of people who say they don't like horror, it's usually that they don't like gore or violence. Yeah. And there's plenty of horror without it. And usually those people will say it themselves. They're like, I like psychological movies. I'm like, cool, there's a lot of psychological horror.
Yeah. And there's a lot of violent movies they probably watch that aren't horror too. A lot of action films probably have a higher kill count than any horror movie.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's just how that violence is portrayed and how it's how it's presented can just varies so wildly between the genres, right?
I guess it is. It's so different for everybody. And to me, it seems funny when people say it's not funny because it's just everybody's different. But when they say they don't like that feeling of watching a horror film. But for me, I actually, if I'm depressed, I like watching a horror movie or a movie with scares and trauma and these kind of things. And afterwards, I actually somehow feel better.
It's cathartic, right?
It is. And I know that catharsis is kind of one of those reasons that people cite for liking horror movies. But who is it? Was it Wes Craven had a great quote? What was it? Horror horror films don't create fear, they release it. And I always thought that's a great quote. But I think that's part of why I enjoy them so much, is I almost always feel better after watching horror movies.
Yeah, and I think there is something to be said for the catharsis of horror movies. I'm the same way. If I'm having a bad day, I don't tend to reach for comedies. I tend to reach for comfort horrors as at this point. So maybe not necessarily martyrs. I know one of my closest friends, I know I've already mentioned Midsommar, but I have one of my closest friends watches Midsommar like all the time as a comfort horror.
Yeah.
And I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, and she has such a great arc in that story, and so I can definitely see that.
It's like if you're having a bad day, just watch out for Danny in Midsommar. Yeah. Like her day's arguably worse.
Her day starts out shit at the very beginning. Wow.
Just right off the top. Yeah.
Oh man, I know. Are there any movies that you've seen that are just like so over the top that like to you they've affected you so much that you just like, I cannot watch this movie again?
The only movie that I really can't watch again, and it's not technically a horror movie, but I argue that it is Requiem for a Dream.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's
Aronofsky, right?
Aronofsky. That's the only one where I watched it and came out of it just feeling so horrible. Mm-hmm. And I have like horror flashbacks to methamphetamine psychosis and those kinds of horrors all the time because of this film, that like I just can never bring myself to watch it again. And I think part of the reason why I can't watch it again is because it's not a horror film. Because if it were a horror film, it would have had a more cathartic ending instead of the one that it is.
I think that's a really good point, because when I think of a movie that affected me probably more than any other was, and it's sometimes thrown in with horror, is The Girl Next Door. I watched that movie and it was just too, I guess, I don't want to say too realistic, because there's a lot of great horror movies that are pretty realistic, but it was something that hit harder. And I think it's what you were saying. I don't really consider it horror as much, but it really deeply disturbed me. And I don't need to see this again.
Yeah, it would have ended differently if it had been a horror movie. And I think I probably would have liked, and I can see the same argument for Girl Next Door. As a horror film, it would have had a different sort of resolution than it did. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. A lot of people like to cite the really ultra gory films as those movies that they would, but to me, those are like popcorn films. I mean, there really is a lot of like comedy in a way, even to the extent of like Human Centipede. That's kind of like something people love to cite, and Human Centipede 2, which is actually just even worse, I think, as far as gore goes. But those are all, I mean, the special effects people even call those gags, the different types of effects that they're doing. So it is just like a comedy film in that way. It's just throwing a bunch of jokes onto the screen. And so you either kind of play along with that, or the disgust is just too much.
And I feel like the best horror films do have some comedy in them. Like you need some levity in there. Otherwise it's just, pile driving tension at you, and you're not going to have as much fun with it. You need that dynamic flow of tension and release, whether it's through a jump scare or through humor.
I think that, and it could be real subtle too. I think of probably my favorite horror movie of all time is Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And it doesn't have outright comedy bits. It might be a couple of minor ones, but there's some real subtle things that are very funny. And overall, you could almost look at that movie as a comedy.
Yeah, that's a great example. And especially when you look at the sequels, they definitely lean further into that.
Yeah, I'm one of these people who loves all of those sequels, even the dumb ones. I think I especially like the dumb horror films sometimes. It's just, I don't know. There's so many different types of horror films. It's really one of the reasons why I like horror, is because it's kind of a genre that people tend to define themselves with. I don't think you see that in other, people gather, maybe sci-fi, but that's sort of horror adjacent, I guess. But, you don't see like comedy movie or rom-com conventions. I could be totally wrong. I don't know. but people and plus the horror movie is just so inclusive, and I think it is attractive to people who feel like outsiders or misfits, and we can kind of all identify and come together for this one thing.
Yeah, I think the promise of delivering on fear is just like, I don't know, it's something that anyone can get in on the ground level on in terms of the genre. But in terms of identifying with an aspect of horror, yeah, I think you're right on the money with that one. And just, it's really interesting to see how people really gravitate to like, I'm really a slasher person. Versus
the subgenres.
Like, and they have like names for like Gore Hounds. Like Gore Hounds are like totally into like, you know, splatter and gore and the hyper violent, ultra violence that you mentioned. Not my thing. I say as even though I said that I love martyrs.
Well, I think that we may be seeing a switch back to some old school slashers with the success of Terrifier and Terrifier 2. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah. I think horror is in a really interesting place right now where we're seeing both like the return of the slasher and the fun horror film. And also seeing it kind of like at the same time, kind of on a parallel path. They're not necessarily on the same path, but on a parallel path, seeing just really interesting social horror, which like there's always been social horror. Anyone who says that horror is getting too deep into commentary on today's like
they haven't seen horror.
They haven't seen horror. It's been doing that since the beginning, since the first horror films. It's been reflecting society and reflecting societal fears. So, but like just seeing really interesting social horror and like you mentioned inclusiveness, just seeing like a lot of different stories being told, and with like, I know the internet's been around for a while now, but just like with how centralized the internet is and how we have like Shudder and different services that can pick up international horror, like it's so much easier for us now to like
Shudder's doing a great job of that.
Yeah, we can watch horror films from like Indonesia and Spain and all these other countries that like we might not have accessed otherwise. And it's just a really exciting time to see all sorts of horror stories.
I think you're right. And I tell people that a lot when I talk about horror, because I think a lot of people are kind of stuck in an old, they consider it like slasher. For some reason, people think, oh, it's another slasher. I'm like, wow, you just haven't seen horror in a long time, because it's really evolved. I think we are right now in sort of a golden age of horror. If it was up to me, that's how I would sort of define this. Maybe the second golden age or something. It's really good. The last decade has produced some of the best horror films ever, really. But I'm very much attracted to this idea of how horror reflects kind of the current culture and contemporary values and actually things that are going on in whatever era you're in. I mean, you can see this going back to like the 50s. Wasn't it like we were all afraid of like, the atomic bomb or the Red Scare? And
Red Scare, all
show up in the movies.
Yeah, no, even before that, like you said, the atomic bomb, that was a little bit earlier. And seeing all the like giant creatures.
That's what happens.
Yeah, that's what happens. You irradiate the ground and you're going to get them. You're going to get giant ants.
Yeah, everything was giant.
Everything becomes giant. Maybe I don't wish for that to happen, but I kind of like miss this like alternate universe where we have all these like giant grasshoppers jumping around.
I want to ride on a giant ant, you know?
But yeah, it's always been there. And like different horror tropes and archetypes have like always reflected certain things. Like there's always been a certain symbolism to the vampire that has existed since like even predating film, that
Vampire's now very homoerotic, isn't it?
It's very homoerotic, but there's also like, there's definitely like a vampire for every generation. Say with the zombie, like there's a zombie for every generation where it kind of like stands in for, actually the zombie might be a better example because it stood in for so many different things. Like we've seen it stand in for consumerism and rampant consumerism and late stage capitalism. We've seen it stand in for, again, some of the Red Scare communism stuff where it's like not being able to recognize your peers as someone you can trust. We've seen like zombies, we've seen vampires do that, have that role too. We've seen anything that does the other. We've seen aliens take on that role. Really, communism comes up a lot in in mid-century horror and its reflection in the monstrous, which is kind of neat. And like you said, fears of queer folks has been not necessarily zombies, but definitely vampires and definitely other monsters as well.
The Shudder, they had a great documentary on Queer for Fear. I'm sure you saw that, but I was, and I look back on some of those movies. It was real funny. Like the Nightmare on Elm Street 2 is often cited there. And I remember watching that when it came out. But at the time, I never really gave that much thought. But looking back on it, I'm like, oh yeah, that was definitely a queer movie.
It's like, this movie's totally queer. And some of these movies have certainly been like claimed by queer communities. And some of them were always like inherently queer, like Slumber Party Massacre always has like a certain queerness to it, even though the subject matter is like kind of your basic slasher. But it was written by queer folks and has a lot of the like campiness to it that like makes it kind of automatically queer, especially the second one, if you've ever seen it.
Oh yeah, that one's hilarious. Really, I love those movies. Yeah. What were some of the other eras that shaped horror? I know, like early 2000s, I'm sure had to be shaped by 9/11.
Absolutely. So that's when you saw a huge uptake in found footage, and footage horror came up a lot after 9/11, which if you think about all the surveillance that sort of came in around that time too, like we got a little bit of found footage right before, 2001, but it was like relegated to like the Blair Witch Project and very few other examples. And then of course the quote unquote torture porn era also found its niche after 9/11 as well, and really coincides with a lot of the like world's concerns about torture that came up in that time. And a lot of xenophobia and a lot of, fears of violence, fears of people from other countries arbitrating that violence. It's like, it's very much, that's where we saw like Turistas, that's where we saw Hostel and a lot of those examples. They're like so emblematic of post 9/11 horror.
Yeah. And you would see this even brought into other types of movies, just kind of elements of that. What do you see is like right now kind of informing films being made? It seems to me there's a lot of films about trauma right now.
A lot of films about trauma, a lot of films about navigating grief. Mm-hmm. Even thinking about some of like the more blockbustery horrors that have come out. Like grief has always been kind of a staple to horror. I feel like, and navigating that, but like, I think you're right that specifically trying to recover from traumatic events like Midsommar, I've brought up 3 times, so I won't bring it up again, but that's a perfect example. Hereditary. Oh, there we go. Thanks, Ari. Hereditary is another perfect example of navigating trauma. The Babadook, we're getting a little bit into the past, but what's a little bit more recent? Smile. Smile is all about navigating trauma.
Great movie. Totally took me by surprise. The trailers to it, I just thought it was just going to be, the smile infects people or something, but it was way deeper than that.
Mm-hmm. And fantastic jump scares in that movie too.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Some excellent body horror. Now, I would say that's a pretty good example of what we're exploring now. And like I mentioned, a lot of social horror. We're seeing, like obviously Jordan Peele's having a great series of films in terms of exploring the Black experience and horror.
What about the pandemic? Do you think we're going to start to see more and more movies kind of reflecting that?
We've seen a little bit
I mean, Host was fantastic.
Host was
but
fantastic.
That happened during it was like a lightning in a bottle, you know?
Yeah, I haven't seen too much in terms of, I think people are all just trying to get past the pandemic.
It's too soon, yeah.
And we haven't seen too much in terms of like, I don't think there's been like necessarily an uptick in zombie films. Like they've kind of never really left. So I think there's been like a little bit more possession horror, which I think is indicative of, again, like if we're looking at society right now and kind of like how we're looking at each other and where we're landing on different sides of very strong sides on issues.
Yeah, I think that just the general polarization that we're experiencing in society right now is going to start to be reflected more and more on screen. That's just a thought. One thing I'm seeing a lot lately is this whole concept of the liminal film. Have you seen these movies? These are like Skinamarink would be, I think, that one of the first ones. These are, and I'm kind of on board with this. You either kind of do enjoy it or you just check out, because they are movies that don't necessarily have a standard story structure or even a plot, so to speak. They're just kind of like, the whole point is to kind of generate these feelings of unease and even dread in some cases. And I rather like that, because that seems like the purest form of horror art possible.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I haven't seen any of the examples other than Skinamarink. I did see Skinamarink.
The Outwaters would be one that I saw recently. We're all going to the World's Fair.
Oh, yes, I have seen We're All Going to the World's Fair. Okay, I see where you're going in terms of the liminality.
Yeah, and I guess they just kind of, even a non-horror film, After Sun, which is really one of my favorite films of last year, kind of had that vibe of like, okay, it's not really a story arc, so to speak, but it's just generated to just cause these feelings in you as you watch it.
Or as my author friends would say, all vibes, no plot.
Yeah. And I know that's a deal breaker for a lot of people.
For a lot of folks.
Yeah, if I mention some of these movies, like, how can you watch that? They're just so boring. You can look on IMDb and read the reviews, and they're like, boring, nothing happens. And I'm like, oh my God, I love this movie.
Yeah, I think it's a really neat space to explore. This is like horror is a sandbox, and film is a sandbox, and I feel like they need to be treated as such. And I love to see what filmmakers do when they're playing in that sand. I love a narrative, so I'm one of those people who kind of struggled through Skinamarink. I like was really trying to
that wasn't
add
one of
story
mine.
to it.
Wasn't one of my favorites either. In fact, out of all of those movies, that's probably my least favorite, even though that's the one that people like to cite. But yeah, and I think it's because I didn't relate to those childhood memories, and I think that's what that whole movie was about.
And I had like, and I was able to relate to like some of the like sort of like latchkey experience, like, but not to the darker sides of the stories. But I found myself trying so hard to force a narrative into the spaces where it really was just vibes. It really was just trying to incite dread. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I like that in your book you make a distinction between being desensitized and what was the word you used?
Habituation.
Habituation. And because I always kind of like to joke with people, it's like, oh, I'm so desensitized to horror movies, but you make the distinction that that's not really what it is.
No, you're probably habituated to horror movies, and like you said, like you've seen enough that you're not really fazed when something happens on screen. But probably if you saw some similar violence happen not middle life. What does that even mean? If you saw some of that violence happen in real life, you would certainly have a reaction to it. You would certainly.
That would be if I didn't have that reaction to real life, then that would be desensitized.
That would be desensitization.
Okay,
gotcha.
Yeah. And that's the thing about horror movies is I love watching all of this stuff on screen, but I cannot take real world violence and horror blood, any of that at all. I can't watch news or anything like that because it affects me so much, which I always kind of am puzzled by that, why I can watch it on screen and actually enjoy it so much, but I just cannot take the real thing.
Yeah, it's all about context. And it's funny, it's even knowing that something is real makes the big difference. Like, because you're still watching something that's on a screen when you're watching the news. An example of something that really affected me was a fire that happened once in a bar where they were using pyrotechnics in a space where they shouldn't. Like, it was just like the stage settings weren't, I think, flame retardant, and something caught on fire and they had to evacuate this bar. And there's footage of it, of people evacuating and kind of tripping and getting blocked up in a doorway. And so the camera like pans around the corner and you see all these people panicked and like crammed into a doorway trying to escape a fire. People died. And watching this video, you can just knowing that it's real and knowing that people died and that you're seeing this is like, it's horrible. It's horrible. Like, I remember watching that. My wife studied theater production, which is why she had seen it and recommended it to me. I don't think they actually recommended it to me. I think they just said, this is a horrible video, don't watch it. And then I looked it up. But they use it in schools to teach about like safe pyrotechnics and making sure that you meet like building codes and stuff like that. Like, I still think about that video all the time because it's terrifying. Yeah. And that's the context of something being real versus the context of watching a horror movie where I've seen like arguably like worse, I'm saying this very loosely, worse depictions of fake events. Right.
Yeah. It's a lot of my problem watching horror. It's not a problem, but it is. It's harder and harder for me to like experience the thrills watching horror that I used to. So I'm sure I'm habituated at this point. But so it kind of like I mentioned earlier, what I do is I try to imagine that I'm not used to all of this. I try to block everything out of my brain and try to really, I kind of almost feel like I have to actively get into movie watcher mode.
That's really interesting. Almost like a sort of horror movie meditation.
It is. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, it almost is a meditation. And considering most of the movies I watch alone, because I don't have a lot of people who like to watch horror movies with me, yeah, it is sort of a meditation, I guess.
I'm wondering if, I'm not recommending that you take a break, but I'm wondering if you took a break from horror films for a little while and went back to them, if you'd find that habituation effect decreased, or whether it would stay sort of static.
Well, I'm probably not going to take a break.
No, that's why I said I wasn't going to recommend it.
No. Yeah, I love watching horror movies. But what are your thoughts on the whole, and this is like an age-old debate, and we see it again and again, and I had Prano Bailey-Bond on this show, and we talked about the whole societal impact of horror, and with her we were talking about the censorship of movies in the 80s and the video nasties. And is there really any science behind making a connection between watching a horror movie and committing those acts in real life?
No.
Set the record straight.
Setting the record straight. Horror has been given a bad rap. A lot of the studies that cite that there is a link were part of lobbies, specifically to try and eradicate horror, the video nasties and censorship, like that sort of piece. It's been extremely cherry-picked. There are some really good literature reviews out there that go through all of these studies and point out the weaknesses. I do it a little bit in Nightmare Fuel as well, pointing to some of the weaknesses of the studies, because it's very hard to measure links between aggression and taking in any sort of media, let alone horror films. But measuring aggression on its own is very hard, and doing it for like longitudinal studies, so over many years, is very hard to do. But generally, most of these experiments were conducted poorly or just had limitations to them because of the kind of research they're doing. But yeah, just the too long didn't read version is no, there's no evidence There's no strong evidence at all to show that horror movies or watching violence will make you more likely to commit violence. And in those cases where those blames have occurred, they're usually pretty unique situations. Where
it's usually just a coincidence.
It's either a coincidence or there is some very specific medical conditions in place that make someone predisposed to.
Yeah, you actually pointed that out, that one of the studies said, well, it's possible that somebody who is already like has violent tendencies or something could do violent acts. I was like, well, there's your problem. The person already has the violent tendencies.
And it's one of those things too that's like where there's like another sucky effect to put it in like super technical terms that these studies have had has been to not only demonize horror films but demonize certain like mental illnesses too, because a lot of people will be like, well, if you have schizophrenia, then maybe you're more likely to take the violence on a TV screen as real and kind of conflate reality and engage in horror, like a horrific act. That's not true either. But that's one of those sort of side effects that has come out of some of these conversations as well. And it's like, someone having schizophrenia does not mean that they're automatically going to be a violent person. Plenty of people with schizophrenia are not violent people. In fact, most of them are not violent people. So it's what you said is like, so it really is just someone who is more likely to already to commit violence is more likely to commit violence. That's the be all and end all. And the horror movies and certain.
It's also really suspect that a lot of people would cite horror films as the reason, but not cite their favorite action films, which, like we were saying earlier, could have a huge death count and just as much blood in them, but somehow that gets a pass, so they put the blame on horror. You see the same thing with music. Music was being demonized, and it was really suspect of what the types of music that some of these groups were going after, whether it was rap or metal. Yeah. It really is just cherry picking a genre that people don't like because they find it unpleasant or unsavory. So all in all, it's just bullshit. Basically. What about as far as like cognitive development in children and any studies with that and what they might be exposed to? Well, the outcome of having like really young children watching violence is probably more likely that they'll be scared. I think that's just it, right? Yeah. Because I wouldn't have shown my son Texas Chainsaw Massacre, not because I thought he was going to develop into a chainsaw wielding killer or something, but just because I knew, okay, well, I'm going to be up all night with him. He ain't going to be sleeping. Because horror movies, like, think of a horror movie jump scare that gets an adult, like they usually are accompanied by like a loud noise and something like getting in your face on the screen. Those sorts of things, especially with very young children, are the types of things that like create, well, nightmares, but also create like associations that might turn into like longer lasting fears. Yeah. So yeah, no, it's really. I remember one of the earliest scenes that I saw that just stuck in my head was a clip from Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. This is a very old movie from like the 50s. And all I saw was the clip, and it had Frankenstein's, I think it was his hand coming out of a coffin, but it was just this creepy hand. And for some reason, I must have been like 5 or something. Just that image stuck in my head for years. It's like, that's the scariest thing I've ever seen in my life. Yeah, I know, like I mentioned in my book, my wife is terrified of E.T. And like, E.T.'s not scary. E.T.'s a botanist. E.T.'s a pacifist. He's kind of freaky looking, but there are some really scary images in the movie, like with the agents that take E.T., like they're pretty scary. And there are a few jump scares associated with, they're not really jump scares, but they're like jump out at you moments with E.T. himself. And I think that was probably enough to make an association where my wife actually like completely forgot that they had even seen E.T. And when I showed them a trailer, they were like just
terrified immediately. Like it was a deeply embedded fear that they had, like
you in the gut.
Yeah. So that's probably, obviously I wasn't there the first time they watched it, but it was probably one of those cases where they saw something that scared them and then it's kind of just got stored in there forever.
Yeah. It's put in that part of your brain that remembers those scenes. Actually, it's the same way with the Girl Next Door for me, even though I saw that probably 10 years ago or whenever that came out, but it's still just those images. And those images may not even be the actual images that happened because I only saw it that one time, but what I remember might actually be worse.
Yeah, your brain has a great way of sort of filling in gaps and catastrophizing certain situations to make them even worse than they were when you originally saw them. Like if you find yourself really freaking out about something you remember from a movie, it might even be worth watching it again because it's going to be, like you said, not as bad as you remembered it.
Mm-hmm. And the filmmakers know this, and they exploit this all the time. At least the best ones are. And Texas Chainsaw is often cited as a good example of a movie that really has no gore in it, but everybody thinks of it as a gory movie.
Mm-hmm. And there's the famous example of like the ear being cut off, that scene in Reservoir Dogs where everyone remembers the ear being cut off and how horrible it was, but it all happens off screen.
Yeah, the camera pans away and then it comes back and the ear's off.
Yeah, but everyone remembers it, and you filled in those memories. And even movies like Saw, like I rewatched the Saw franchise recently, probably in the last year or so. And rewatching it, it's a lot less gory than you remember it. Mm-hmm. It's way more of a police procedural.
That's exactly what I was going to say. It's really just a kind of a procedural.
With some cool contraptions. And like you see some stuff, but it's not nearly as bad as your brain makes it out to be, which I think is fascinating. I think kind of a coup for the Saw franchise on its own, just to make people remember it as worse than it was.
That is really interesting because I think that's the film people like to cite as torture porn, but I don't really think Saw is. So we're just a thriller movie with cops chasing down the bad guy, and I actually like that part of them. Actually, just the kind of the finding these clues and putting it all together, and the surprises in it and the reveals. I always find that really interesting. And there's a new one coming out here next month.
Yeah, in 2023, a new Saw film.
I know, Saw X. Are they calling it Saw X or Saw 10? I don't know.
I'm not sure.
Like Jason X. I love
Jason X, a classic.
I love that movie. It was so good. Jason in space. What more do you want than that? Huh?
There were some really creative kills in that one too.
Oh yeah, there is. Yeah, that's what Kane Hodder. See, that I love Kane Hodder. He's one of my people. I just want to be choked by Kane Hodder. If I could be choked by Kane Hodder, then my life will have been complete. So what, all in all, was there any surprises that you learned after all of the people you talked to and all of the research you did on this book? Was there anything that stood out to you? Like, well, I just did not know that.
You know, I think the coolest part of working on this book was talking to folks who actually apply all of these techniques without necessarily thinking about them in like research terms to make horror films. So like I got to talk to, film editors and sound editors and directors and writers. And it was really cool just to hear them all talk about the same thing. And what it really boiled down to from their perspective wasn't like inciting fear so much as understanding empathy. And I think it was just really interesting that everyone I talked to brought up the same thing, and they all said that their work was really empathetic and really involved sitting in feelings in order to craft a scene or to craft a moment, more so than being like, oh, I'm going to make something look so scary. And I thought that was just really fascinating that's where everyone's minds were in terms of just like actually living those moments of not just fear, but like grief or tension or stress or relief, and finding those moments to craft a scare.
I think horror is just the best way to look at ourselves, look at our own personalities, and look at culture surrounding us. And it really puts a mirror up to all of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nina, it was great having you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much.